All right, we are now ready to start our program. Welcome again, everyone. This annual meeting, I will just mention again, this part is being live streamed. We will be turning off the live stream a little later today, and we'll let you know when that happens. This year, as we were celebrating our 40th anniversary, the annual meeting planning committee, a committee of the board, very quickly focused on philanthropy as the theme for this meeting. In part because it is our 40th anniversary, but really far more because the conversations that we have been hearing, witnessing, and experiencing have been about philanthropy from so many different people over the course of this year. We know that a lot of you really reflect and think about how you can bring your own personal values, your organizational values, all together in the work that you do to advance the social good. And we know, as Mike talked about a bit earlier, that the tenor of our national discourse and the long list of incredibly critical global challenges that we all face has made the work of philanthropy feel all the more important. Given that, there was no better place for us to host what is a really important conversation than in our new home at the Ford Foundation Center for Social Justice. And there is no one better to start off our day's programming than your colleague and our longstanding member, Darren Walker, president of the Ford Foundation. 3 years ago, in his annual message, Darren called on us to imagine a new gospel of giving so that we might, and I'm quoting now, build a world where we no longer are as necessary. Those are the conversations that we want to have today and that we're going to continue over this next year. We want to critically examine the field of philanthropy, and we want to be really honest with ourselves about the challenges we face. We want to consider all of the criticism that we've heard fairly. And at the same time, we want to look for the answers. We also really want to ensure that the work that we do demonstrates the very unique role of philanthropy and how we can play a role in creating a stronger, more democratic, and equitable society. So now I am hoping that Darren is backstage and is going to join me.
I'm right here. I've been right there. Hi, I've been right there. It just seemed more efficient for me to just be right here.
That was great. Thank you. I'm glad you're here.
Of course.
All right. Well, yeah, this is on. So maybe a way we could just start, because Darren is really just going to kickstart off the whole day of programming. Maybe a way we could start is for you to explain why we were lucky enough to be one of the tenants you wanted in this building. What was your vision for us being here?
Well, first of all, thank you all for being here, and thank you for your support of this vitally important organization. I had the great privilege of being on the board of Philanthropy New York when it was the New York Regional Association of Grant Makers. It just shows how old I am. And it's so inspiring to see how the organization has evolved under your leadership and the great work of the board and staff to get to this really important moment in the history of the organization and at this critical time in philanthropy. I was thrilled when you said yes, that you all and the board, everyone agreed that you would move into the center, in part because the vision was that this building would be transformed from what had been a building that was built just for the Ford Foundation, a very inward, not in a negative way, in the way in which office buildings were built in the 1960s, very inward looking in that it was really about making the people who use the building on a daily basis have a wonderful experience from the perspective of the 1960s. And the 1960s, it was Mad Men. And so the building was very hierarchical. It was very much in a corporate manner designed. And so, you know, on the top floor we had an executive dining room, and in order to go into the executive dining room, and I was a grantee of the Ford Foundation when I was at Abyssinian, and to be invited into the executive dining room with my program officer, and at one point he said, we may have the vice president stop by and say hello to us, and it was very exciting. And so, you know, and the president had her, in the case of Susan, private dining room, and the president's office, you know. I mean, I had this like Mad Men 3 suites and my own kitchen and bathroom and 40-person conference room, and it was a little, yeah, but Kevin...
It was scary
Roche,
to visit you, to be
well,
perfectly honest.
but it's really interesting because the wonderful Kevin Roche, the designer of this building, who sadly passed away but lived a full life to 97, when I said that to him once when we were walking through, I said, you know, Kevin, visiting the president's office is so intimidating. And he said, it was designed to be intimidating. And he was really explaining that in the 1960s, if you were the president of an American institution, American company, an American university, an American foundation, you were the king of the world. I mean, it was this notion that to be in, so it's a different day. And so when we realized that we would, the vision to move away from all of these offices and hierarchy and people having status associated with their office, if it was an internal facing the garden or I mean, all of that stuff, which was really not about our work and what's going on out there. So to do away with offices and to have open work space and to be a more collaborative foundation, that actually provided us a chance to reduce our own footprint. And it was, again, consistent with the notion that the building would be turned outward looking and that we would be in the service of our mission. And part of the service of our mission is to strengthen philanthropy. And so the notion of being able to have you all in the building was just a huge dream of mine. And so I was so thrilled about it.
It was our dream too. So it was a huge honor to be here, and we are delighted, and it's been an incredible experience.
I'm so glad.
So today's program is really focusing on the field of philanthropy and thinking about the field. And as you know, over the last, year, 18 months, there has been what feels like an extraordinary amount of criticism of the field of philanthropy. I'd love to hear just a couple of words from you about your reaction to all that criticism.
Well, I think it's scrutiny of philanthropy is not new. I think the different tenor today is what is troubling and challenging. And the places it's coming from as well. Right? So let's just start with the notion of scrutiny. I actually think we should be scrutinized. I actually think we have a huge public granted privilege. And so the public has granted donors in this country the privilege of and the advantage of reducing their liability on their own family tax in exchange for producing public assets and public goods. And so I think the questions around what public assets and public goods are we producing and scrutinizing us with those questions is right. And we should be very comfortable with that scrutiny. And in some ways, it should make us uncomfortable because there is, if we're to be honest with ourselves, a an inherent part of the work that we do that is uncomfortable, right? So, and this gets to the new gospel conversation and my little book plug, which will be out, the book will be out in the fall, The New Gospel of Wealth, From Generosity to Justice.
We're officially inviting you
Yes,
back.
you are officially invited to the book party. In fact, I'll probably have you do a book party for all these wonderful people. Anyway, the book is free, so it's not, you know, I'm not hawking anything. The idea of the new gospel and the notion of Andrew Carnegie being comfortable with his wealth, but uncomfortable with the view that you die wealthy, right? And so Carnegie's view was that he looked very disfavorably at the idea that a wealthy man would die wealthy, but he had absolutely no problem with inequality. His view on inequality was that inequality was simply a natural thing, and that the question for men like him and John D. Rockefeller was, what do we do with all of this wealth? And we should do things that are ameliorating poverty, and we should be charitable and generous, and we're good Christian men, and we should use our own faith. And so there was a whole very, very compelling argument that he made that really is the basis of American philanthropy, and then tantamount then to the basis of global philanthropy, as we know. What Martin Luther King said in 1968 was what has inspired me to talk about a new gospel. And what he said was a very different idea than Carnegie. What he said was the following: philanthropy is commendable, but it should not allow the philanthropist to overlook the very injustice which makes philanthropy necessary. And so what King was saying was actually, you rich people, you should actually be really uncomfortable that there is so much inequality in the world that you're creating that you now have to figure out a way to give back. And that giving back actually isn't enough. And so what we're seeing today is that critique, we're hearing it loud and clear, that's simply saying, after I take all these things, now I'll decide what I want to give back. And by the way, what I want to give back should be underwritten by all of the citizenry, all of the taxpayers, right? That is the tension that that should actually make us a little uncomfortable. I am very proud of the work of the Ford Foundation. I'm very proud of the work that all of you and that philanthropy does. I think we could all do a better job, starting with the Ford Foundation. I think, and I, every day, am negotiating the things that I feel uncomfortable about. Not uncomfortable in a guilt, like, oh, I feel guilty, that kind of uncomfortable, but uncomfortable in that, am I demanding enough of myself and of my institution to deliver on the idea of justice and reducing inequality, which is our mission. And so the critiques, which I can speak for Ford, which used to come mostly from conservatives, are increasingly coming from progressives and people that we have not been criticized by in the past. And many of them are right. They're right to ask questions about how are we investing our portfolio. They're right to ask questions about why do you spend so much money on staff? Okay, I mean, those things I think are absolutely fair game. And I should not feel defensive about having to answer to those questions.
So let me just ask you one more question to sort of really get us going in the conversations we're going to have today. When you think about both the criticisms and some of the solutions that some of those critics have posed, are there things in particular that you are hoping to see in the field of philanthropy going forward?
Well, I think, again, I've talked about this a good amount. I'm a capitalist, And, you know, I once, when we were doing our strategy work here, when I was president, when I became president, we did our, you know, strategy stuff, which all of you have done, all of your strategy. And, you know, and so the notion was, you know, all the smart program officers, you know, put forth your ideas for things we should work on, you know, and then they would send me, you know, summaries of all the ideas. And there was this, in the economics packet, there was a couple of people said, we should explore a new strategy that looks at an alternative to the capitalist system. And it was like, can we stop? I mean, like, we're capitalists at the Ford Foundation. The problem is we have a form of capitalism that is distorted and that's delivering far too little benefit for a very sliver of people. And so part of what I believe we have to do is be comfortable talking about the way the capitalist system is fulfilling its responsibility to democracy. And that intersection for a foundation like Ford, which has as one of the 4 pillars of our mission, strengthening democracy. And so often people will say to me, you know, how did you get to some of the, you know, how did you get to inequality from strengthening democracy? Well, there's a direct correlation between the strength of our democracy and the idea of social mobility. And inequality is harmful for social mobility because inequality makes social mobility, economic mobility, the things that have been bedrock to our democracy, less likely. There will be fewer stories like my story and many of your stories of people who start with modest beginnings, with families where you're the first to go to college, and all of those narratives about American opportunity. We will have less of those stories. And if we have less of those stories, it's really bad for our democracy. So there is a direct correlation, and that's how we got to inequality in part. But it's, we have to be comfortable talking about these things, and this is what in philanthropy we've not always been comfortable doing, in part because our donors, you know, as Henry Ford has said, you know, you should appreciate the capitalist system. It's made it possible for us to have all of our endowments and us to do all the work that we do. And we do appreciate it. But if we are to sustain it, it has to change. Or all of us and our entire sector will be imperiled.
Thank you. That is exactly the perfect introduction to our day's programming, and I'm so appreciative that you came and joined us for this. Thank you.
Thank you, Rana. Thank you very much. It's a treat. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Rana.
I'd now like to ask Kyung Yoon, our new board chair, to come up.